They bought her to give the Duke an heir, and sent her home when she failed, and the paper said Baron, and Lady Honora Vane read the word aloud twice, as if Verity might not have understood it the first time. She did not yet know that the word was a lie, bought with silver and violet water, and she would not know it for the better part of a year, and by then it would have cost her nearly everything she had left to spend. Verity Hale. She had never truly become Verity Vane, not in her own mind, not in a single letter she had written home to her father, stood in the middle of the great hall at Caramere, with her hands folded before her like a woman at prayer. And she did not weep. Weeping was for women who had somewhere softer to fall. The trunk at her feet had been packed for her, not by her, the linens folded wrong, the way a stranger folds linens, and she noted this the way she noted everything, filed away, dated, kept. Her mother had taught her that. Write down what you see, not what you are told to see. She had been telling herself that all morning, the way another woman might tell herself a prayer. "You have had a year and a day, my dear," said Lady Honora, and her voice was so gentle that a person passing in the corridor might have thought she was offering comfort rather than a verdict. The physician is quite certain. There is no shame in it. Some women simply are not made for the getting of children, and it does no honour to anyone to pretend otherwise. Verity looked at the certificate in Honora's hand rather than at Honora's face, because Honora's face gave away nothing ever, and the paper at least held still to be read. Dr. Marlowe's signature sat at the bottom of it, cramped and apologetic, a man's hand that did not want to be doing what it was doing. "Where is his Grace?" Verity said. It was not truly a question. She had learned in a year and a day that some sentences wore the shape of questions only because English demanded a mark at the end of them. "Seeing to the North Fields," said Honora. "There is always something wanting his attention at Caramere. You will forgive him. Marriage is a business before it is anything softer, and the business here is concluded." The word concluded sat in the air the way a coin sits on a table after it has been set down too hard. A footman came through the far doors with a folded paper in his gloved hand, and for one unreasonable moment Verity's heart did something foolish and hopeful, because the paper was sealed with the Duke's own ring, pressed into red wax, and inside it was nothing but her name, in his hand. And beneath her name, nothing at all. No explanation, no farewell. She folded it once and put it inside her glove against her wrist, where her pulse beat, and told herself it was severance, the last coin of a bargain concluded, and she was very good at telling herself things, and almost good enough at believing them. Peg Loach stood by the door with the smaller bag, her jaw set hard enough to crack walnuts, and when Honora turned to instruct the coachman, Peg leaned close and said, "Lo." That cordial never sat right with me, not from the first week, and nobody asked me, on account of nobody ever asks the maid anything, which is a great mistake on the world's part, if you want my opinion, which nobody does. Verity almost smiled. It was the nearest thing to a smile she had left. "Write it down anyway," she said. "Someone will want it read aloud some day." She did not know how soon that would be, or how much it would matter, or that at that very hour a man on a grey horse stood at the crest of the ridge above the carriage drive, too far to be recognised, near enough to watch the wheels turn, and did not come down, because coming down would have told his aunt everything he could not yet afford her to know. The carriage went out through the gates of Caramere at 11 in the morning, and the gates closed behind it with the small final sound gates make, and Verity Hale, who had not failed at anything in her life that she had been permitted to try honestly, rode home to her father's house, believing herself the first woman in 100 years to be bought and found wanting in the same breath. She was wrong about the wanting. She would spend the next 3 weeks and the whole of the Michaelmas Assizes finding out exactly how wrong. A year and a day is not so very long, Honora Vane had said once, early in that year, in a voice so soft it might have been mistaken for kindness. If a man is patient. And I have had practice. Verity had not understood the sentence when she first heard it. She would understand it perfectly by the time it was read back to her. In a courtroom, in Honora's own hand, months later, and by then it would no longer be able to hurt her, because by then she would have proof. It had begun, in fact, a little more than a year before, with arithmetic rather than romance, in the Duke's own library, with the door left properly open, and a clerk scratching figures at the far table as chaperone. Alaric Vane, Duke of Carrow, had not risen when she entered, which she noted, and had not apologised for not rising, which she noted also. He was a tall man built for standing still, with hands that did not match his rank, scarred across the knuckles, ink stained at the second finger, a labouring man's hands set incongruously beneath a labouring man's shirt sleeves and a duke's coat. "Miss Hale," he said, "your father owes £1,100 to men who will not wait for it, and I require an heir within the space my father's will allows me before the entail passes to my cousin. I am told you keep excellent accounts and better secrets. I propose we solve both our arithmetic together. That is not a proposal of marriage, Your Grace," Verity said. "It is a proposal of merger. Call it what you like. This is not romance, madam, this is arithmetic." She had turned the signet ring on his hand over in her mind for a full week afterward, the way he had turned it on his own finger while he waited for her answer, before she understood that gesture was the only tremor he allowed himself. She said yes for her father's sake, and told herself that was the whole of her reason, and was nearly good enough at believing that, too, Peg came with her to Caramere as the only face from home permitted to cross that threshold, and on the first night, unpacking trunks by candlelight. She said what she would go on saying in one form or another for the whole of the year to come: "Man's got a face like a shut door. But I've seen shut doors with fires lit behind them. You mind yourself, and mind that aunt of his twice as hard. Sweet as she talks, she never once offered me so much as a boiled egg, and in my experience, ma'am, the truly kind always feed the servants first." Verity had laughed, actually laughed, for the first time in a week, and Peg had looked absurdly pleased with herself, the way she always did when she had managed to be useful and blunt in the same breath. The wedding itself was small, a matter of contracts more than of vows, and afterward Verity kept her own ledger the way her mother had taught her. Dates, doses, symptoms, a woman's monthly accounting, kept in the same neat shorthand her mother had used to track fevers and births in the village of Larkwell, a script no one at Caramere could read, even if they found it, because no one at Caramere had ever needed to learn a dead herbwife's private hand. Her mother, Agnes Hale, had died when Verity was 19, of a fever no one troubled to name properly. 3 years after the village had half turned on her for a foxglove dose correctly given to a squire's son who died anyway of something else entirely. "Write down what you see, not what you are told to see," Agnes had said, over and over, until it was less a lesson than a heartbeat. It was the only inheritance Verity had been permitted to keep. She kept it scrupulously. She would need it more than she knew. The still room at Caramere belonged to Lady Honora, the way a chapel belongs to its priest, and within the month Verity understood that every cordial, every tonic, every cup of the fortifying wine the household physician, recommended for a new bride hoping to quicken, passed first through Honora's hands. "You'll take it each morning, my dear," Honora said, "the first week," pressing the little glass into Verity's fingers with a warmth that never once reached her eyes. "I promised Alaric's mother, God rest her, that whoever came into this house as his wife would be looked after as my own. I keep my promises. It is, I believe, my only true vanity." She smoothed the black enamel ring at her wrist as she said it, a small unconscious gesture Verity noted and filed without understanding. The way she noted everything. The household reacted to the new Duchess as households do, calling cards left by families who had not called in a decade, wagers laid discreetly in the servants' hall on how long before an heir was announced, gossip carried up from the village that the new Duchess was too plain to have been chosen for beauty, and must therefore have been chosen for breeding. A cruelty Verity absorbed the way she absorbed most cruelties, by filing it and moving on. She noticed, in October, that the cordial tasted different on some mornings than on others, a bitterness under the honey, faint, almost polite about announcing itself, and she noted the date in her ledger in her mother's shorthand, and told herself it was nerves, and did not yet understand that nerves, in her mother's teaching, were exactly the sort of thing one was meant to write down rather than dismiss. Warmth, when it came slowly and through work rather than words. Alaric found her one December afternoon in the stables, with her sleeves rolled and her hands buried in a mare's flank, easing a foal that had turned wrong in the birth canal, giving low, precise instructions to a groom twice her size, who obeyed her without question, because competence, once demonstrated, requires no further argument. He stood in the doorway and watched her save 2 lives with her bare hands, and did not say anything at all until it was finished. And then he said, "You did not tell me you could do that. You did not ask what I could do," Verity said, wiping her arms on a rag someone handed her. "You asked what I could give you." It was the closest she had come to accusing him of anything, and he took it the way he took most blows, standing very still, letting it land. "That was arithmetic talking," he said finally. "I find I am not always fond of what arithmetic says." He almost smiled then. The first crack in that shut door Peg had spoken of, and Verity, watching it happen, understood she had just witnessed something rare enough to be worth marking, and marked it, and did not tell him she had. 2 weeks later, over his father's old estate ledgers, which would not balance and which he confessed, low and unwilling, frightened him more than he liked to admit, because a duke who could not read his own accounts was a duke waiting to be robbed. She showed him the trick her mother had taught her for catching a false entry, read the totals backward from the bottom, where a tired eye stops checking, and he laughed, once, short and startled, as if the sound surprised him as much as it did her. "There," she said, "that is twice now you have laughed within a fortnight. At this rate you will ruin your reputation for gravity entirely." "Do not tell my aunt," he said. "She has built half her authority in this house on the certainty that I never do." Something in the way he said it, light on the surface, careful underneath, she noted that too, and did not yet know what to do with it. She missed her courses in February, and told no one, not even Peg, not even her ledger at first, because she had learned early that hope, like medicine, was safest taken in small doses until a woman was certain it would not make her sicker to have swallowed it. By the second missed month she allowed herself to write it down, in her mother's shorthand, on a page she folded twice and kept beneath the false bottom of her workbox. She did not tell Alaric. She wanted, absurdly, to be sure first, to hand him a certainty rather than a hope he might have to watch die. She was 11 weeks along. By her own careful count, the morning Honora brought her a new cordial, a particular strengthening receipt, my dear, for a woman in your delicate way. You needn't look so startled, servants talk, and I am glad of it, glad to be able to look after you properly now. And smiled with a warmth that did, this once, nearly reach her eyes, which was the most convincing lie Honora Vane told in the whole of that year. Verity drank it, because refusing would have required an explanation she was not yet ready to give, and by nightfall she was bleeding, and by morning there was no child, and no one in that house but Verity ever knew there had been one to lose. Dr. Marlowe, summoned, found nothing but a woman weakened and grieving in a manner he could not account for, and wrote, in his careful apologetic hand, that her Grace showed signs of a nervous and delicate constitution unsuited to easy conception. And Honora carried that verdict downstairs to the servants' hall herself, gently, as though it grieved her, and it was the first stone laid in the wall that would, 8 months later, become the word Baron read aloud twice in the great hall. Verity told no one what she had actually lost. She wrote it in her ledger instead, dated, precise, the only mourning she permitted herself in ink rather than tears, and closed the book, and did not open it again for a long while, because some pages, once written, are too heavy to keep reading. The illness that followed frightened Alaric badly enough that he came to her himself, sat by her bed for 2 nights running, and on the second night, in the low candlelight, said, "I do not know how to be gentle. I was raised by a woman who thinks gentleness is a thing you perform, rather than a thing you feel, and I have spent 30 years unlearning the difference. Badly. Verity, weak but not broken, said, 'You are gentler than you know, your Grace. You simply do it with your hands instead of your mouth.' He looked at his ink-stained fingers as though seeing them for the first time. 'My mother died when I was 9, he said, of a wasting sickness no physician would ever properly name, and my aunt raised me afterward, and I have never once doubted her devotion, because doubting her felt like doubting the only steady thing I had left. I tell you this so you will understand why I am about to disappoint you. I cannot yet give you the whole of what troubles me. There is a thing I cannot lay before you, not yet, not until I am certain of it myself, because I will not hand you a suspicion I cannot prove and ask you to carry it beside your grief." It was the first true thing he had told her about himself, and also the first door he had opened only halfway, and she understood, even then, that some cost had been paid to open it that far. Honora offered her a settlement within the fortnight, gentle, reasonable, terrible, a comfortable annuity, a small house near the sea, freedom from a marriage that had brought her only sorrow, no scandal attached, for your own sake, my dear. No one would think the less of you. And Verity, still weak, still grieving a child no one else knew she had lost, refused it, flatly, without raising her voice, because leaving would have meant conceding a failure that was not hers, and because some part of her, arithmetic or not, had begun to want to stay for reasons that had stopped being about her father's debts entirely. It cost her something real to refuse. She did it anyway. She conceived again in July, quietly, and this time told no one at all, not even the ledger, until she had tested the morning cordial herself, the way her mother had taught her to test a suspect draught, a drop on the tongue, a colour held to candlelight, a smell compared against the receipt book she had copied out from memory in her first month at Caramere. The bitterness under the honey was pennyroyal, and beneath that, fainter, tansy, both of them things no midwife gives a woman hoping to carry a child, both of them things a great many women have used, quietly, for the opposite purpose, since long before anyone troubled to write it down. She sat very still for a long moment, 2 fingers pressed to the pulse in her own wrist, counting, the way she counted everything that frightened her, and then she opened her ledger and began, at last, to write down everything, every date, every dose, every symptom, going back nearly a year, in her mother's private hand, because ink does not lie, even when everyone around a woman is lying gently, for her own good. Peg found the scrap of a burned letter in the still-room grate 3 days later, fetching kindling, half consumed, Honora's careful hand still legible across what remained, for my nephew's wife's tonic, discretion assured, the usual measure, and brought it to Verity with her hands shaking. The first time in a year Verity had ever seen Peg's hands shake at all. Before either of them could act, Honora acted first. She went to Alaric with Dr. Marlowe's honestly mistaken opinion, and her own carefully seeded account of a nervous, delicate, possibly hysterical young wife, obsessively recording her own body in a private cipher no one could read. You have seen the book yourself, Alaric. Is that the mind of a settled woman? And she said, very gently, smoothing the black ring at her wrist, a year and a day is nearly up. If you do not act now, the assize will act for you publicly, and everyone will know the reason, and it will not be kind to her. Send her home quietly, before it comes to that, and I will see the settlement made generous. Call it mercy if you like. I am only ever thinking of her welfare, and yours, and the name we all 3 carry. She did not say what would happen if he refused, not in words, but she let the black ring catch the light, and Alaric, who had buried a mother he could not save, and had spent 20 years believing his aunt was the one fixed point in a shifting world, understood for the first time in his life that the fixed point might be the thing moving the ground beneath him. He could not accuse her without proof strong enough to survive an assize, not without destroying the dukedom, his cousin's name, and very possibly Verity's safety along with it, if Honora moved to protect herself first. So he did the only thing that bought time without tipping his hand. He agreed, publicly, coldly, to send his wife home as a failure, and privately began, that same night, to pull Dr. Marlowe's certainty apart, thread by thread, and sent word to the one man in the county who could tell him exactly what pennyroyal and tansy were worth to an apothecary, and how a purchase like that gets written into a shop's own ledger, whether the purchaser likes it or not. It was the coldest, hardest thing Alaric Vane had ever done, sending her away with nothing but a folded paper bearing her name, and no explanation, and he did it because he could not yet prove to a courtroom what he already believed with his whole ruined heart, and because the one thing worse than losing her to a lie was losing her to Honora's next, quieter attempt at mercy. Verity did not weep on the road home, not with her father's shocked, careful pity waiting at the other end of it, not with the neighbours already murmuring behind their curtains about the Duchess sent back like unsatisfactory goods. She unpacked her own trunk herself, badly folded linens and all, and that night, by a single candle, she opened her ledger properly for the first time since the loss in February, and read it straight through, every entry, every date, in her mother's hand inside her own, and understood, cold and clear, exactly what had been done to her, and when, and very nearly by whom. Peg arrived 4 days later, with the burned scrap of letter sewn into the lining of her cloak, and an account of Sowerby the apothecary's shop ledger, which the parish had once made him keep openly after a complaint about short waits, and which any respectable person might, with the right question asked the right way, be permitted to see. You are not going to sit here and be sent home twice, Peg said, hands on her hips, apron dusted with road dirt. Not while I've legs to walk you to Roding myself. The assize is in 3 weeks, Verity said. Then we have 3 weeks, said Peg, which is 2 more than most people get, and I intend to use every one of them. Verity looked down at the ledger in her lap, at her mother's hand and her own woven together across a year of small, exact, faithful entries, and thought of the words her mother had said so many times they had worn smooth as a stone in a stream. Write down what you see, not what you are told to see. She had done that. Now, for the first time, she understood it had not only been grief she was recording. It had been evidence. She closed the book, squared it corner to corner against the table's edge the way she squared everything when her hands needed something steady to do, and began that same night to plan how a woman with no rank, no fortune, and no friend at court might make herself heard in a room built to silence exactly her kind of truth. Roding filled slowly in the days before Michaelmas, carts and carriages crowding the assize green, and Julian Vane arrived among the first of them, cold and correct in his travelling coat, inspecting his gloves as if they might report on the journey's dust to someone who cared. He had not asked many questions of his mother in 26 years of being provided for, and he had told himself that not asking was a kind of respect. But he had watched his cousin's marriage collapse from a careful distance all that year, and something in the timing, always his mother nearby, always some gentle inconvenience befalling the Duchess just when an heir seemed nearest, had begun to sit wrong in him, the way a wrongly set bone sits wrong, aching worse the longer it is ignored. He found Sowerby the apothecary already 3 cups into the tavern's ale the night before the hearing, sweating despite the cold polishing spectacles he was not wearing, and made the mistake, from his mother's perspective, of asking him plainly what he had sold Lady Honora Vane across the past year, and for what declared purpose. Sowerby did not answer him, but he did not deny it either, and a man's silence, held too long over the wrong question, is its own kind of confession, and Julian rode back to his lodgings that night, turning his own ungloved hands over in the dark, cold with a doubt he had never let himself feel before. The assize hall at Roding was not built for spectacle, but it filled like one that Michaelmas morning, benches crowded with the ordinarily curious and the extraordinarily invested alike, and Sir Bevil Ashcroft took his seat at the front with the weary patience of a man who had heard 1,000 petty grievances and expected this one, an annulment on grounds of barrenness, to be the 1,001st and no more interesting than the rest. Honora Vane sat composed and beautiful in unrelieved grey, her mourning ring catching the light exactly once, and Dr. Marlowe's certificate lay ready on the clerk's table, and for a quarter of an hour it seemed the matter would be as brief and bloodless as Honora had promised Alaric it would be. Then the doors at the back of the hall opened, and Verity Hale walked the length of the aisle with her ledger held against her chest like a shield, Peg 2 steps behind her with her chin up and her hands, for once, not shaking at all. Alaric rose from where he had been sitting apart, grey-faced with 3 sleepless weeks, and something in his face when he saw her come through that door was not composure at all, and every soul in that hall who had ever been in love recognised it instantly, whatever they called it aloud afterward. "Your Grace," said Sir Bevil, not unkindly, "this is somewhat irregular." "So," said Verity, "is being sent home for a failure I did not commit, Sir Bevil, and I have brought the proof of it, if the court will hear a woman speak for herself for once, instead of about her." A murmur went through the benches, quickly hushed. Honora's composure did not crack, not yet, but her fingers found the black ring at her wrist and stayed there. "The court is always willing to hear proof," said Sir Bevil, "provided it is proof, and not merely grief dressed as testimony." "It is both," Verity said, "which does not make it less true." She opened the ledger to the marked page and held it toward the light from the tall windows, her mother's shorthand running beside her own in 2 hands grown, by the end nearly indistinguishable. "This is my own record, kept daily, in a script my mother taught me and no one in that household could read. Here, the 11th of February, the day I first missed my courses. Here, the 23rd, the morning I was given a new cordial by Lady Honora's own hand, described to me as strengthening. Here, that same night, the beginning of a bleeding that ended. By morning, a child I had told no living soul I carried, because I wished to be certain before I gave anyone the joy of it. I was not barren, Sir Bevil. I conceived twice within that marriage. I lost both children within a day of being given a cordial I did not prepare and did not choose. The hall had gone entirely silent, the kind of silence that has weight to it. "This is a private diary," said Honora, and her voice was still gentle, still reasonable, and grief can persuade a woman of a great many things that are not. "In fact, so, it is not only my word," Verity said. "Mr. Sowerby of this town has kept a purchaser's ledger for 11 years, as the parish once required of him. I asked the court to summon it. Sowerby, seated near the back with his hat in his lap, went the colour of old tallow. Alaric stepped forward then, and it was he who put the precise question, low and level, the stillest anyone in that hall had ever heard him. "Whose coin paid for it, Mr. Sowerby?" he said. "Not whose order was given. Whose coin?" Sowerby's hands shook so badly the spectacles he was polishing clattered to the floor, and into that silence he said, in a voice barely above a whisper, "Lady Honora's, Your Grace." Every time. Pennyroyal and tansy, dressed as a tonic on my own ledger because a lady of quality asked me kindly to word it so, and I was fool enough, and poor enough, to do as I was asked. Peg produced, then, the burned fragment of letter from beneath her cloak, and laid it on the clerk's table, beside the shop ledger, and the 2 hands, ash-edged and ink-fresh, matched exactly. Sir Bevil read the surviving line aloud himself, because a magistrate's voice carries where a servant's does not, for my nephew's wife's tonic, discretion assured, the usual measure, and beneath it, unmistakably, Honora Vane's own seal, pressed into wax gone brittle with a year's keeping in a drawer she had thought no one would ever open. Honora did not weep, not at first, and not from shame. She looked, for one unguarded moment, very old and very tired, and she touched the black ring at her wrist the way a woman touches a wound to be certain it is still there. "My husband," she said, quiet now, all the gentleness gone brittle, died believing I would see our son safely provided for. I promised him. I have kept every promise I ever made in my life, save my marriage vows, which death took from me before I broke them, and I was not going to watch my son pushed aside for a stranger's child brought in off the road. Julian, standing near the door, went white and then said, in a voice that cracked on the first word, "Mother, I never asked this of you. I would rather have had nothing at all." It was, in its way, the most honest sentence anyone in that hall had spoken all morning, and Honora, hearing her son disown the gift she had ruined 3 lives to give him, wept then, at last, not for herself. Sir Bevil, when the hall had quieted enough to hear him, did not send for the constable. "The law permits me to send you to trial for what has been proven here today," he said to Honora, "and I confess some part of me is inclined to it. But a trial makes a spectacle of a young woman's grief that I do not think she asked for, and it drags a family name through mud that will settle on the innocent as surely as the guilty. Lady Honora Vane. You will remove to the dower house at Fenway, alone, on an allowance sufficient for comfort, and no more, and you will not set foot on Caramere land again while you live. This is not kindness to you. It is protection for those you have already harmed enough." Honora bowed her head and did not argue, because there was, by then, nothing left to argue with. They walked out of the assize hall together into an ordinary grey Michaelmas afternoon, the kind of light that does not know or care what has just been decided beneath it, a lark somewhere in the hedge going on with its small business exactly as it had before anyone inside had spoken a single word, and Alaric stopped her on the green, in front of half of Roding, and turned the ring on his finger once, out of old habit, before he made himself still. "I told you once this was arithmetic," he said. "I was wrong. Arithmetic has no remainder. I have loved you with something left over I have never been able to account for, and I did not send you home because you failed me. I sent you home because I could not yet prove what I already knew, and I would rather you hate me safely than love me and be poisoned slowly for it. I am asking you now, with nothing left to buy and nothing left to fear, for no reason but the true one. Marry me again, Verity, not because your father owes anyone a shilling, not because Caramere wants an heir. Because I wish it, and because I have learned at considerable cost that wishing is the only currency I ever actually wanted to spend on you." Verity looked at him for a long moment, the ledger still held against her chest, and said, "You did not buy me. So stop trying to pay for me now. Ask me properly, the way a man asks a woman he has nothing left to offer but himself." "Will you?" he said. "Stay?" "Yes," she said, and it cost her nothing at all to say it, which was, after everything, the strangest and best proof of all. The second wedding, some weeks later, was small on purpose, held in the old chapel at Caramere, with no one present but the household and Verity's father, who wept without shame through the whole of it, and Peg, who wept harder than anyone, and denied it fiercely to every person who dared mention it for the rest of her life. Julian gave up his claim to the entail in writing, before the ink on the register was dry, took a modest post managing a neighbour's neglected estate, and within 2 years had made himself so honestly useful there that the family gave him their daughter along with the stewardship, and he wore no gloves at all on his wedding day, by his own choosing. Sowerby lost his licence to trade, but not his liberty, and went, at Verity's own quiet insistence, to apprentice under an honest apothecary 2 counties off, where he lived out his years mixing nothing he could not explain to a magistrate's satisfaction. Dr. Marlowe, mortified at how thoroughly his own honest ignorance had been used against a woman who deserved better of him, became, unbidden, the fiercest advocate Verity ever had in matters of the county's medicine, and helped her, in time, secure a licence of her own to practice what her mother had only ever been permitted to practice in secret. The village of Larkwell, hearing the whole story eventually, as villages do, quietly repaired the stone over Agnes Hale's grave, the one that had stood unmarked for 6 years since half the parish turned its back on her over a dose correctly given, and added beneath her name the words her daughter chose. She wrote down what she saw. Honora lived out her days at Fenway in a comfort she had not entirely earned, and a solitude she had entirely chosen, and Julian visited her twice a year, out of duty and in time, something gentler than duty, and she never once complained of the terms, because some part of her, at the end, understood exactly what she had been spared. A year and a day later, almost to the date, Verity stood again in the great hall at Caramere with a paper in her hand, and this time it was not read aloud by anyone but herself, in her own voice, to her own husband, and it was not a verdict, but a name, chosen together the week before, written in her mother's shorthand beside her own, for no reason, but that some habits are worth keeping even when the fear that built them is finally, entirely gone. She held their daughter against her shoulder while she read it, and outside the tall windows a lark was singing in the hedge, going on with its small business exactly as it had the day everything had seemed lost. Because the lark, as her mother always said, does not stop singing for anyone's misfortune. And this time, at last, it was singing for something worth hearing. If this story warmed you, the quiet ledger that outlasted every lie told over it, the love that waited to be asked for the right reasons, then stay a while longer by the fire with me. There is a chair kept warm here, a kettle just off the boil, and I would love to know in the comments which lines stayed with you longest, the moment Verity opened that ledger to the light, or the moment Alaric finally told her the truth he'd been too afraid to spend. If you'd like more evenings like this one, consider keeping your place by the hearth and subscribing. It costs nothing, and it means the candle stays lit for the next story. Until then, be gentle with the quiet, overlooked ones in your own life. They are so often keeping better records than anyone ever gives them credit for. Sleep well, and write down what you see.